Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you are watching us today. My name is Dr. Mahmut Cengiz. I am Associate Professor at the Terrorism, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center and the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. I will be moderating this session. This is a continuation of a series of talks by eminent people in the field of terrorism. The views expressed are those of the presenter. Recently, we have given our focus on the far-right extremism, but according to our database, 58% of terrorist attacks were perpetrated by jihadist groups in 2021. So these groups that have convened under the banner of ISIL or Al-Qaeda are still active in many regions of the world. Both groups were able to do notable attacks, as you all know, in various EU countries in the last 2 decades. Also, our database records lone actor terrorism in Europe by far-right extremists and the European-born Muslims, known also as the homegrown extremists. Today's event will host Dr. Teun van Dongen and the focus on the development of global jihadist movement and the response from Europe. Dr. Teun van Dongen is a national and international security expert. He worked as a policy analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, a think tank in the Netherlands, and he has been a lecturer in comprehensive security at the Holland University of Applied Sciences. During his period at HCSS, he has been seconded to the Dutch National Coordinator for Security and Counter-Terrorism. Teun is currently the program lead, current and emerging threats at the International Center for Counter-Terrorism. Teun regularly writes for academic journals, newspapers, and international affairs magazines. He holds a PhD degree from Leiden University, which he gained by writing a doctoral dissertation on counter-terrorism effectiveness. Please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We will have about 20 minutes for dialogue after Teun's presentation. Teun, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mahmoud. One small update regarding the resume you just read. I'm no longer affiliated with the ICCT. I'm an independent terrorism researcher now. And so for today, I want to cover a lot of ground in not a lot of time. The development of the global jihadist movement and response from Europe is obviously a major topic that we could talk about for hours. And so as a way to bring some focus into my presentation, I thought it'd be helpful to sort of go back to 2015, when for a while it appeared that ISIS was everywhere. This is, of course, the era of the major terrorist attacks in Europe, and we saw those coming from Syria and Iraq. But then we also saw the emergence of these ISIS provinces, and that kind of raised the specter of one big terrorist organization that was networked all over the area that you can see made black on the map. And the fear, of course, was that that would eventually turn into the realization of what is the probably still is the ISIS dream, that big caliphate that covers pretty much the entire Islamic world and also some parts of a little further up north. And I think in looking at the phenomena as it was developing then, there were it was kind of feasible to look at ISIS and think of it as it being a global insurgency, where all the various parts would be attached to that same monster that we had to fight. And this was also, as you will remember, part of the sales pitch to potential supporters. I mean, it displayed a level of ambition that was attractive to a new generation of potential fighters. I also think that its internationalist approach appealed to people whose identity was not primarily ethnic, but rather Islamic in general. So they felt some sort of attachment to everyone who was of the same faith. And that helped them identify with a project like the one ISIS was working on. And I think this picture that I'm showing you on the slide itself stands as evidence of the appeal that ISIS project had towards its support base, because it was made by ISIS supporters and then spread amongst them. I think that shows you how strongly that message of this big caliphate in the making, how strong that actually was. But we're not in 2015 anymore. So I think at this point, you know, some 8 years down the road, we can assess whether the fears that were expressed back then were justified. And on the face of it, it certainly looked like there was this big movement. I had in preparing this presentation, I had to think of that saying, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. And to some extent, you could apply the same logic to ISIS. So the influence of ISIS on other groups around the world is very visible. There indeed was that influence. Jihadist groups began to act like ISIS in a variety of ways. First of all, there was the adoption of ISIS tropes in the way they presented themselves to the world. So this picture that you're seeing of the execution video was shot in Libya, but it has all the trappings and the characteristics of videos that ISIS previously put out. So even on that maybe still fairly superficial level, you could see that there was clear influence from ISIS on other groups. Maybe on a more strategic level, we saw groups with a clear penchant for sectarian attacks, meaning attacks against other Muslims. And this is something where they deviated from Al-Qaeda, who were less eager and likely to do so. The idea of takfir, of declaring Muslims who adhere to other versions of Islam to be infidels, is something that became a very strong common element in all of these groups that were affiliated to ISIS or that identified themselves with ISIS. And maybe on a more operational level, we've seen the spread of tactics from ISIS central, so to speak, in Syria and Iraq to other branches. So, for instance, the use of drones and tunnels is something that is believed to have traveled from ISIS central to other places like Libya. So they were adopting ISIS MO on a very operational level. And perhaps most dramatically, there were the attempts at governance. So previously, Al-Qaeda was apprehensive about really taking control of a territory that was under their that was in their power. So Al-Qaeda is also fighting for that caliphate, but they felt that it wasn't time yet to start actually building it. This is very different in ISIS, and it is different in the sense that in that ISIS movement, groups had much fewer reservations about governing territory, and so as we will see below, there have been several attempts to actually create that caliphate and not see it as some ambition for far in the future, but as something that you can do right here, right now. And again, this is also part of what made ISIS appeal to its potential support base. It also exposed some weaknesses that these groups also had. So, for instance, carrying that ISIS brand really puts you on the radar of security forces. ISIS was widely perceived, and still is, of course, as a major threat and something that drastic measures would be legitimate against. So the adoption of that ISIS moniker also exposed some groups to some government pressure that they weren't really equipped to adequately deal with. And second, and that refers back to the governance, the ambition to govern territory. Some of these groups began to do things that they weren't really ready for. So there have been instances of ISIS governance by groups who really didn't have the resources to get it right. So there were a lot of advantages attached to becoming part of that ISIS orbit, but it also came with some downsides. At the same time, though, to some extent, that image of ISIS as this coherent global insurgency has always been a little misleading too. So, as I said, there was influence on the one hand, yes, but it's also more complicated than that. There have been, to be sure, instances of ISIS Central directing or supporting ISIS branches. I think Libya is an important case in point. ISIS Central sent people there to give training, and they decided on leadership positions. They said who was supposed to be in charge of ISIS groups in Libya. There's also several financial hubs from which money would transfer from ISIS to other ISIS branches. So I don't want to minimize the, let's say, the actual material ties that exist between those various ISIS branches and ISIS Center. Propaganda is, I think, another area where you could argue that there was some real that there were real connections between the various ISIS branches and ISIS Central. There have been ISIS branches that provided input to ISIS Central for their propaganda, so they would submit like images or videos that ISIS Central would then sort of rework into its propaganda efforts. There've also been instructions going from the center to the branches about how to set up social media campaigns and that kind of thing. So again, like these I think are ways in which you could look at that group of groups, if you will, as being connected to each other. But at the same time, in many cases, there has been little contact between ISIS and the branches. A lot of these groups were supposed to really take care of their own business, especially in operational terms. So they had to fund their own operations, had to decide on their own targeting, carry out their own attacks, provide their own training. And so they really just had to look out for themselves. And in a lot of those areas, it was like that long after they joined the ISIS brand. And so I think it's also possible to look at the idea or the notion of the global caliphate as a propaganda trope. And it's one that was pretty successful because it did give the various branches and ISIS itself this notoriety that was very important for instance, recruitment and propaganda purposes. But it's important to stress that the actions of the various ISIS branches were always driven to a considerable extent by what was happening in the local context. And I think even I think that is clear even in the process of accession to ISIS itself. Because in what you could see there is that these local dynamics played an important role in making groups decide to try and get into that ISIS orbit. So, for instance, and that's where we get to the question why some of those groups ended up wanting to join the ISIS brand. In some cases, there were new leaders who wanted to gain some legitimacy for themselves within their own organizations. So they were up and comers. Previous leaders had been eliminated or somehow taken out of the picture, and then the question was, okay, so who's going to take over? And then there were these guys, these up-and-comers, who were also looking for a way to establish their leadership positions within their own organizations. And reaching out to ISIS and establishing ties with ISIS was a way to do that. So those would be internal purposes for the move to identify an organization with that ISIS brand. Maybe on a more organizational level, it was a way to gain status externally, meaning gain some notoriety by identifying yourself with ISIS and therefore maybe attract more followers and funding. So there were some groups who weren't really doing all that well and were looking for a way to kind of establish their reputation, and again, like identification with that ISIS brand was a way to get that. And I think a very interesting example of this local dynamic playing into decisions to associate yourself with ISIS is the Islamic State in the West African province. Or maybe Boko Haram, as it was called then. In that case, there were some group members who saw that affiliation with ISIS as a way to rein in a leader, Shekau, who is in the picture on the left, to rein him in because they felt that he was out of control. He was being too dictatorial and also made some strategic decisions that some of those group members weren't really agreeing with. And they thought that maybe if we can establish a tie with ISIS, we will have like an authority above that leader, and so that there'll be a way to control him. And that, I think, shows you the importance again of that local agenda as driving decisions by various groups to decide to adopt that ISIS moniker. So it's a very, very mixed record. It's not easy to say that whether it is well, the broader ISIS movement was really this coherent international phenomenon, or whether that was just a smokescreen to hide a series of isolated insurgencies. I think it has a little bit of both. And a couple of years later, we can now establish in very general terms where we stand. So what has this way of operating brought the broader ISIS movement? Are we looking at this global insurgency, or is it maybe something else? Well, there have been attempts to build a caliphate, as I mentioned, and ISIS in Syria and Iraq is obviously the major example. I think Islamic State in the West Africa province is another important example. I think it's pretty, at this point, pretty embedded in the regions around northern Nigeria, where they are, where they control territory, and they're even now in a position where they themselves can act as a center of source. So they will communicate with other branches and also send some money around to other branches. Therefore, there's also been less successful attempts. I would include Libya, Sinai, and Somalia in that category. And those attempts to build that caliphate were short-lived, and I think in a lot of those cases, it's fair to say that there was some overreach, as I mentioned earlier. There was some overreach on the part of those groups where they began to engage in initiatives that they weren't really capable of pulling off. And most importantly, there was no linking up these various caliphates into that bigger transnational caliphate. So it was in a way a series of bottom-up initiatives that didn't really tie together in a way that the propaganda was suggesting. So I think rather than that global insurgency or transnational insurgency towards that big caliphate, I think what we're looking at is indeed a series of local insurgencies that are indeed linked in some ways and occasionally. And some of these groups are very active and dominant actors in the regions where they're operating. And it's not always clear cut. I mean, it's not always clear cut as whether an insurgency is winning or not. So I'm speaking about this in very general terms. But I think a group like ISIS in Khorasan in Afghanistan, there's some debate about how strong they really are, but I think we can be sure that they are making a serious effort to undermine the credibility of the Taliban as a governing actor. So they're committing mass casualty attacks amongst the population. They're also attacking embassies to undermine Taliban's effort to reach out to China and Russia. And I think they're also engaged in some out-of-area operations. So there have been some rocket attacks in countries around Afghanistan. I would also include ISWAP, Islamic State in the West Africa province, as a group that has a very strong presence in the area where they are operating. There are also a couple of ones that are maybe less successful. I think Algeria and Tunisia would fall into that category. Maybe to some extent Somalia, the Congo, and Libya. I think in all of these cases, they are groups who kind of reach their limits, so to speak. So they don't really have the resources to escalate their campaigns into anything more than it is right now. And by the way, this is not to denigrate or minimize any of the damage that these groups can still do. But in comparison to their ambition level, I think it's important to stress that they are facing a variety of enemies, and in response to that, have moved to other areas, or have decentralized their operations, just to make sure that their operational security is sort of more or less guaranteed. And I think this brings me to the last point that I want to make, which is the European response, because I think that notion of a more scattered, localized issue explains the way that Europe has been responding to the threat in recent years. Well, it is well known that there's been some scaling down of efforts directed against terrorist actors outside of Europe. There's been a withdrawal from Afghanistan. There's been a withdrawal of French troops from Mali. Several countries have also withdrawn their troops from MINUSMA, the mission to stabilize Mali. I think the global coalition against ISIS has been less active, and a lot of that has to do with a rethinking of priorities on the part of European countries. So, for instance, the war in Ukraine is taking up a lot of military resources, and it makes it also difficult to engage in more military adventures at the same time. And because that terrorist threat to Europe is meaning directly to Europe, the risk of big terrorist attacks taking place in Europe has diminished. Attention has also shifted to other forms of extremism. So in my country, the Netherlands, the Secret Service issued a report yesterday or the day before yesterday about anti-institutional extremism. And also I've seen in recent years a shift towards right-wing extremism. Maybe partially related to that is the fact that the electoral support for military missions on other continents has decreased. People are less eager to accept, in the absence of a very tangible terrorist threat to the European continent directly, have been less eager to accept missions in faraway places that they find hard to find on a map and that don't yield any immediate gain for the country themselves. And so I think in wrapping up, maybe that let's say as the threat of that global or transnational jihadist insurgency is decreasing, our efforts against it are also becoming so less coherent. I think that countries are in Europe in a way withdrawing into their own boundaries for a variety of reasons. And yeah, it's kind of hard to find good visualizations of abstract concepts like decentralization and dispersion, but this set of arrows I thought might do the job. I think I'm not per se against spending fewer resources on terrorism, but I think an issue that we need to address is the ways in which these various insurgencies can affect Europe in indirect ways. So, for instance, they can cause migration flows that will then end up in Europe. And so I think a more strategic view of the ways in which those various insurgencies, which are still lethal and real, can impact on European security in a broader sense will be helpful in thinking of our next steps. And on that note, I want to give the floor back to Mahmoud, and I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Teun. Thank you so much. So there are some questions in Q&A box. So I want to start with my question. As far as I see, Teun, you have some articles on jihadist extremism, especially in Europe. So do you think radicalization is an issue in Europe? And if so, what are some causes of radicalization? And what EU countries are recording more radicalized individuals?
I'm sorry, was that about the causes of radicalization?
Yes, yeah, in Europe, especially in European countries.
In Europe. Yeah. Well, I think people radicalize for a variety of reasons, and those reasons differ from person to person. I think if you want to explain it in very broad terms, it's probably helpful to think of it as being driven by some sort of political drivers and some more personal drivers. So, for instance, and this is a personal frustration of mine that I've been carrying for a couple of years. But what I think we in Europe fail to acknowledge is the extent to which the jihadist attacks that we've seen in Europe are a response to our military activities in the Islamic world. So a lot of and this, like, I have a database in which I keep track of this. There's a pretty sizable majority of perpetrators of terrorist attacks who are quite clear about what they try to achieve with their terrorist attack, and that is they want to put a stop to Western military intervention in the Islamic world. And like the best example out there, I think, is the London bombings of July 2005. You can still find the video messages left by the perpetrators online, and they are very clear about how they see the strategic logic going. So what they will say is, or what they actually did say is, like, these attacks will keep coming as long as you are keeping your military in Iraq, in Afghanistan, as long as you're supporting Israel, right? So that, I think, is something that is maybe an underestimated factor in driving people towards jihadist groups. I think on a more and there's also, by the way, there's also, of course, people who do it out of convictions, who feel that affinity with the ISIS worldview, who feel that it is necessary to restore Islam to the place it had when it was at its zenith, and so those are some more political reasons for people to want to join ISIS. Then on a personal level, it gets really mundane. So there have been people who joined ISIS, for just for the status, or because they were friends with someone in a neighborhood and they went, and so they tagged along. Also, the idea that you're this warrior that everyone's afraid of is much more appealing than just sitting on your couch if you don't have a lot going on in your life. So there are all these political and personal factors that occur in different combinations in each individual. So I think the last thing that I want to stress about that is that we should be looking at more than simply religious fanaticism, because I think there's some interesting and this is, by the way, not uncontroversial among terrorism researchers. I should be honest there too, but I think there's some interesting evidence that suggests that lots of people who joined ISIS didn't really have strong religious beliefs, and so they acted much more on those personal and mundane factors that I also mentioned. I think you're on mute.
Okay, thanks, Teun. So the second question is from Tracy McDonald, who is studying counterterrorism finance as well as local currency or mobile money, as Hawala as well. So Tracy's question is, I heard you mention each group of ISIS is responsible for their own funding, and also what is the way of fundraising and making payments for this each ISIS branch? Then the question, how ISIS core is controlling the purse strings.
Sorry, the second part of the question?
Does ISIS Central Core control the purse strings?
Oh, right. Well, the answer to the first question is in a way simple, because anything criminal you can think of, there has been a jihadist group who did it to get money. So what they will do once they move into a certain territory is they will start extorting people. And they may use different terms. They will call it taxes, but it's really mafia style extortion. So that's one thing. Trade in illegal trade, that is in natural resources. ISIS got rich off of oil. There's also jihadist groups that have been involved in diamond smuggling. Drug trafficking is another one. I think Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is an important example of a group that established ties with drug smugglers and made a lot of money off of that. They also like they don't always have to buy their resources. There's also a lot of ISIS branches who got sophisticated weaponry from actual armies that they were fighting against. So in several cases, there have been ISIS branches who got their hands on tanks that were left behind by the armies that they were fighting. So it's a really diverse mixture of all sorts of criminal activities that they engage in, and then in addition some stealing from their enemies is where they get their resources. Regarding the role of ISIS Central in that, well, there are a couple of hubs. There's one in Somalia, there's one in Turkey, that ISIS Central uses to funnel money towards the various branches. But the extent to which they are doing that is not the same in relation to all branches. So like, for instance, like I think we can be fairly sure that such funding is going to ISIS in Khorasan. But there are also ISIS branches that we really have no evidence for that they ever received money in that way. So it's not a very uniform procedure in that way. But I think I think it's fair to say that ISIS Central is not coordinating all of it, but there are certainly instances where in which they actually are controlling at least some of it.
Thank you, Teun. Also, another question from our Deputy Director at TRAC, Judy Dean. So her question: could you talk more about the rivalry between ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the impact it has had on their development?
Right. Okay. ISIS and Al-Qaeda are at each other's throats for a variety of reasons. One of them has to do with strategy. And as I mentioned earlier, Al-Qaeda is of the view that it's too early to start building caliphates, and ISIS is really using it as its selling point. So there's a difference there. Another difference is, I think, has to do with targeting. So as I mentioned, and that again is a bit of a strategic point. As I mentioned, ISIS considers like pretty much any Muslim who has different views on what Islam is about to be an infidel, and therefore as a legitimate target for terrorist attacks. So what you see a lot of these ISIS branches do is, for instance, commit attacks against Shia targets in the areas where they are operating. Al-Qaeda is, it's kind of mind-boggling to use the word moderate in this context, but they are more apprehensive about committing attacks against other Muslim targets, and so those are at the most political level the reasons why they're fighting. Another one has maybe to do with like involvement in drug trafficking. There's a for instance, ISIS in Afghanistan is against involvement in drug trafficking, but the Taliban is doing it, and there may be some Al-Qaeda involvement there as well. So they're also not seeing entirely eye to eye on legitimate ways to gain funding. What is interesting on the operational level is that Al-Qaeda is in fact in some areas acting as rather Al-Qaeda branches, Al-Qaeda affiliated organizations are acting as brakes on the expansion of ISIS groups. Somalia is an example of a country where ISIS isn't really becoming big because they have to fight Al-Shabaab. And you know, there are other examples. I think another one is JNIM, the Al-Qaeda affiliated group in the Sahel, that is occupying some of the territory and also keeping it out of the hands of ISIS. So there's also. It's not just a matter of doctrine or ideology. It's also like on the ground, where these groups are fighting, and if they're not fighting, at least acting again, like acting as brakes on each other's growth. So if there's just a strong Al-Qaeda presence, there's really no room for a really big ISIS presence. And so in that sense, you could think of it as a bucket that you could fill with Al-Qaeda, and then there's only a little more room left for ISIS. And so those regional dynamics are I think very important to take into account, also to understand the growth potential that ISIS has in certain areas, and I think that potential is limited for often a variety of reasons, and in some cases those reasons include Al-Qaeda's presence, or rather the presence of Al-Qaeda affiliated organizations.
Thanks, Teun. I think this is our last question. And there are so many good ones, but I should just pick one because of our timing issue. So
give the best one.
On Haley's question, in Europe, is jihadi terrorism still considered the #1 extremist threat? How does far-right extremist terrorism compare with jihadist extremism in Europe?
I think if you would look at that purely in terms of terrorism, it will be a coin flip. And by that I mean that in both cases, the threat is mostly coming from isolated individuals. And we have to be careful with using the word lone wolf, because in a lot of cases we will find that people who we thought were lone wolves actually do have ties or connections to the broader movement, but there are people who will execute the terrorist attacks on their own, and you know, inherently that limits your potential. I mean, there's no way. Well, it's very difficult. Okay, so when I say this, people also always throw Breivik at me, but it's very difficult to commit a very large-scale terrorist attack on your own. Now, I think I think currently in Europe, far-right terrorists and jihadists are facing the same limitations in that way. So I think it's hard to really say that one is a bigger terrorist threat than the other. What I would add to that, though, is that the picture perhaps becomes different if you would take into account maybe non-violent ways in which extremism can cause problems. I think one of the parts of the right-wing extremist threat that we need to come to terms with, and that we need to recognize, is the more gradual way in which they erode a democracy. So just to give you, I mean, I could talk about this for another hour, but to give you an example, a lot of this online rhetoric is right-wing extremist, but is phrased in such a way that it doesn't immediately look like it's right-wing extremist. So they will do that by using humor or irony, or maybe couch their terminology a little. So instead of saying these people are from an inferior race, you're going to say something like, I'm a race realist, and therefore I believe that people from different cultures shouldn't be living together. And so in phrasing your message that way, you can spread it in a way that attracts a lot less attention, and that then you can spread a message in a way that doesn't make you look like an extremist. And that I think those kinds of more gradual creeping ways of spreading the right-wing extremist ideology do not have a counterpart, at least not to the same extent, in jihadist extremism. So if you look at it purely in terms of terrorist threats, again, like it's a photo finish. If you take that broader perspective and say, okay, extremism can be harmful because it's violent, but it can also be harmful in different ways, then I'd be inclined to go for right-wing extremism as the bigger threat, because it has a broader strategic repertoire to do damage in non-violent ways. And so for that reason, if I had to choose, I would go currently for right-wing extremism as the bigger extremist threat, even if it's not necessarily the bigger terrorist threat.
Thank you, Teun. Today we have hosted Dr. Teun van Dongen to discuss about EU response against global jihadism. So thank you so much, Teun, for very insightful and informative presentation. And thank you all for joining us today. If you want to join us as a guest speaker in the future, please let us know. Thank you.